Thank you very much, Stephanos. I'm indeed delighted to be here and to talk about someone who I was so close to for so many years and who I think is a very significant presence with us today. Neil was an extraordinary architect, but he was also an incredible human being. He touched people in many, many ways. I had the great pleasure of working with him for over 25 years and watching many wonderful things happen that I could learn from. He was thought of by many as the father of regional architecture in Texas. If he wasn't the father, he was at least the midwife, because he was very close and he was always nurturing the idea of place. For many of those years, at least through the middle of the 20th century, I think he was either a leading architect or the leading architect in this Southwest region. And so there's a lot to talk about, and I'm not going to try to cover much of that because it's impossible. I want to tell you about him and what some of his thoughts were and some of his values. Neil was born in Pink Hill, Texas in 1905. You won't find Pink Hill on the map anymore, at least. He died at the age of 76 in San Antonio. He was a product of a family imbued in the arts and in the making of things wonderful and practical through the crafts. He was orphaned. His father died when he wasn't orphaned, but his father died when he was 12, and Neil sort of had to take over the family. So he really was tested as a very young person. He was a lover of the land and of its simplicity and its beauty. He wasn't formally trained as an architect. He did have some schooling, but he really learned largely through a mentorship and by his own wits. Reading was something that he was very, very much into as a young person, and he read voraciously, and he traveled extensively at every opportunity he could. He combined his great love of the land and of the place with the development of a deep understanding of towns and cities and of the social and economic circumstances that created them. He was teaching at Harvard in the early 50s, and he wanted young students, to see something more than architecture. He wanted to see the bigger picture. So he gave them homework, and homework was like reading out of Trollope or Thackeray or Dickens. So he wanted them to learn about the relationship of architecture to life and to economics and to society. O'Neill was perhaps the first Texas modernist, and indeed one of the first modernist architects in the U.S. And he was a modernist in the 30s, by the way, more than he was at the end. First modernist in the U.S. to stress the importance of conservation and preservation, and to base his work on the principles that parallel today's thoughts about green architecture and about sustainability. These themes permeated his practice for his whole life. As Patsy Swank wrote about him, architecture, he thought, is the art which provides mankind with the most beautiful, efficient, and productive setting from which to get on with the business of life. Architecture is the partner of the natural environment, and however difficult the choices, a working balance between the two is the first calling of any architect who claims the name. He influenced in many ways. O'Neill influenced architects and others to transcend their limitations, primarily by asking them to adopt a relationship to values. To some extent, they were his values, but values in any case. He recognized early that he could accomplish far more through others than merely by himself. His life was consequently extraordinarily rich in complexity, and he touched others, though sometimes only briefly, to a depth they remembered long after with great emotion. When I was going around the state, I was president of TSA back in the Texas Society of Architects back in the early 80s, And so I had to go to each chapter, 19 chapters, and make a little talk about what we were doing. And invariably, 2 or 3 architects would come up afterwards and said they just wanted to tell me how much Neil had meant to them. And he said, hey, they would never remember me, but when he was here 20 years ago and he talked to the chapter, he said this, and he said, I've always lived by that. Things like that. They were very, very touching. And it was amazing to me how that happened all over the state, every place I went. His legacy probably isn't easy to define, and I'm not going to attempt to do that, but though it is certainly very great. The large number of architects he inspired, certainly that's part of it. So was his dedication to values and his having the guts to stand up for those values, even if he lost commissions. He recognized that another job is always waiting somewhere, but there is no making up for a loss of credibility. When his chief battleground for a lot of this was San Antonio, he married into a wonderful and dynamic family, and his wife was a preservationist, conservationist, and so was his mother-in-law, a very stern lady. And they fought the good battles. And in 1950, when they first began to really engage the enemy, so to speak, the Philistines, the reigning sort of idea in San Antonio is, the Chamber of Commerce boys, as Neil would call them, was that San Antonio needed to be more like Dallas. And so that was the fight, and it really was real, and make it like some other place. And over the years, by the time Hemisphere closed, or at least within 5 or 6 years after that, that sort of had passed, and people realized that San Antonio was important in its own right and needed to be more like San Antonio and not like some other place. And that was very largely, a large part of that was due to O'Neill and his persistence about this. O'Neill's sense of his own roots as a small-town product of the land never left him. It was connected in myriad ways to his belief in the rightness of a regional approach to design, that the roots of a place and its building traditions ought to be reflected in its architecture, not an unusual concept today. He especially revered the individual contributions and the contributors to the whole building process. A building was, therefore, not something just drawn, as much as it was the product of a mason and the carpentry foreman and craftsmen and painters. And those people on jobs loved O'Neill. O'Neill deplored the ugliness that he saw engulfing America in the 50s and 60s. When in 1964, he was asked by Rice University to lecture as the people's architect, he had this to say: this physical and social ugliness is producing a very real and shocking effect on the youth of our country. The usurpation and defamation of land by vulgarians and the construction of square miles of shacks have given us a generation of children with blinders built on both sides of their heads and minds. They move along our city streets, looking through a narrow slit, seeing nothing as they pass, and seeking only the decent places that they know, their houses, their schoolrooms, their green playgrounds, where there is release and relief from the billboards, the dull architecture, the flamboyant huckstering. Like sightless fish in a deep ocean holds, they know not what they see or what they do not see. They have few discriminative powers. Their standards are the billboards, the insistent neon signs, the black poles, transformers and wires, the ugly lettering, the misleading advertising, the permastone houses. He had another word for permastone houses, but I don't think I can say it here. O'Neill saw context and place as the cohesive force that provided a way out of the aimlessness that characterized so much of the urban development of his time. For O'Neill, context provided the starting point. He was a healer of places and not a bomb thrower. He cited the Spanish artist Goya, who said he felt a great measure of reluctance, almost fear, when he faced a clean canvas. I walked around a site up in New York looking for that first building of Skidmore College in the snow, trying to place it, and it was just a horrible thing to try to put the first stake in the ground. O'Neill spoke out again and again about the crass subdivisions and commercial development that flourished everywhere in Texas, and in fact, for that matter, throughout America and largely throughout the world. He wrote, "One cannot forget the beauty of the towns on the islands of Greece, where there is constraint but variety. One can quickly," he went on, "one can quickly understand why Guanajuato, San Miguel, Oaxaca, and 100 other places of great integrity and beauty are loved, visited, and timeless. Nothing would be so silly as an effort to copy all or parts of the great towns. But it should be just as foolish not to remember why they are beautiful." And he goes on, "I believe we are trying to say that good modern architecture is itself a continuation of traditional principles, which is changed and modified by the gradual advancement of building technology and economic evolution. All architecture that isn't the Las Vegas, Miami variety was built upon this solid evaluation." He was very hard, by the way, on Miami and Las Vegas. "Everyone admires and talks about simplicity, but almost every building is garnished with superficial and manneristic gadgetry." Neil goes on in conclusion, "We must use any advantage of progress in structural design and building systems for the sake of economy and speed. But we should remember that we have thousands of years of precedent that can teach us. We must be serious about the matter of quick obsolescence, of passing cliches, of egoistic fancy for the glorification of the designer." I.M. Pei, in endorsing O'Neill Ford for the AIA Gold Medal in 1982, wrote, "I do not know of any architect in our time who has contributed so much to design, preservation, education, and public service with such grace and humanity as O'Neill Ford." O'Neill served on, just a great number of national and state boards, commissions, and councils, and made many substantial contributions to architecture, design, the environment, and the arts in general. In 1968, he was appointed by President Lyndon Johnson to the National Council of the Arts, and his service to the council was especially satisfying to him, to others, and was important. In 1977, his colleagues at the National Council declared him to be a National Historic Landmark with a certificate beautifully engraved, sealed, and handsomely framed. It's not clear exactly what authority they had, but O'Neill was not at a loss. He responded, "Does this mean I can never be altered?" Well, in fact, Neil was in fact not ever altered, and many feel his spirit still influences and inspires much of what they accomplish today. Thank you very much.